We're going to start with Joyce Trotman Jordan, who will talk about the mission and offer the land acknowledgement. Joyce, just give me a second, please, to spotlight you. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Kim. The land on which we are living is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We pay respect to the Lenni Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in their homeland and in the diaspora. We also acknowledge the millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants on whose backs this nation was created. Not in Our Town mission statement. Not in Our Town, Princeton is a multiracial, multi-faith group of individuals who stand together for racial justice and inclusive communities. Our focus is to promote the equitable treatment of all and to uncover and confront white supremacy, the system that facilitates the preference, privilege, and power of white people at the expense of non-white people, and pits racial and ethnic groups against each other by upholding a hierarchy based on proximity to whiteness. Our goal is to identify and expose the political, economical, and cultural systems which have enabled white supremacy to flourish, and to create new structures and policies which will ensure equity and inclusion for all. In our commitment to uncovering the blight of white supremacy on our humanity, we take responsibility to address it and eliminate it in all its forms through intentional action, starting with ourselves and our community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Okay. Well, it's my pleasure and honor to be able to have the opportunity to introduce Micah Herskind. Micah is an Atlanta-based organizer and abolitionist, a policy associate at the Southern Center for Human Rights, and a member of the Georgia Freedom Letters core organizing team. He is a co-creator of the #8to Abolition political education project and co-facilitates a Slack group chat for Christian abolitionists. Micah writes, tweets, and sometimes speaks about prison abolition and the harm of mainstream criminal justice reforms, and keeps an updated resource guide on prison and police abolition. I had the great pleasure of meeting him when he was a student on the Princeton University campus, and it's my great pleasure that he has come back to Princeton today, virtually, to speak with us about abolition. Thank you, Micah.
Thanks for having me. All right, well, it's so good to be with you all tonight. I'm going to share screen. All right. Cool. Well, thanks for having me tonight, everyone. It's great to see you all. Nice to see some familiar names and some new names. Like Kim said, my name is Micah Herskind. And I'm really excited to be with you all. New Jersey holds a really special place in my heart. I spent 4 years there for college and wrote my senior thesis about New Jersey's criminal legal system. So it's really good to be virtually back in New Jersey. I also just want to name at the beginning that I am a white person doing this work and a white person who has not been incarcerated. And so I think that's important to name at the beginning. I want to name that I'm not an expert in these topics and that we all bring different forms of expertise to this work. And so I'm hoping to share with some of you all what I've learned and all learn together. All right. So we're short on time. I'm going to be moving a little bit quickly because there's a lot to get through when you're talking about abolition in under an hour. And so really just want to start by naming the two sort of main goals for today's workshop, which are to understand the prison industrial complex and the movement for its abolition. So we want to dig into some of the basic frameworks and definitions and history of this movement and understand what is the thing that we're actually trying to abolish. And so my hope is that this will address some of sort of the big questions. So what is abolition? Why abolition instead of reform? Is abolition practical or even doable? And if it is doable, how do we actually do it? How do we build towards abolition? And so first, thinking about the prison industrial complex, or the PIC, I'll be referring to it as the PIC tonight, and mass incarceration. One of the first sort of key moves that we're going to make is expanding beyond mass incarceration to talk about the PIC, the prison industrial complex. And so these two graphs, especially the one on the left, probably look really familiar. I think that at this point, a lot of people know about mass incarceration, the fact that our prison population really ballooned starting in the 70s. And now we have about 2.2 million people who are incarcerated, and then millions more who are on probation or parole or under some other form of state control. And so this term, mass incarceration, has really been popularized over the past 10 years or so. And a lot of amazing organizing has sprung up around it to combat mass incarceration. And so the question is, how does the PIC differ from mass incarceration? And we're going to get into definitions in a minute. But for now, I'll say that sort of as I understand them, one of the key differences between the PIC and mass incarceration is, I think that mass incarceration often describes the scale of our current system of incarceration, so how big it is, and then it also often refers to the extreme racial concentration and racism of the system. Those are often the two things that we hear about with mass incarceration. You're probably familiar with the term the New Jim Crow, as was popularized by Michelle Alexander's book. And so that's sort of what mass incarceration gets at. And the PIC is focused on those things as well. So how big and, sort of all-consuming the system is, and, just how racist and classist it is. But it also looks at sort of how this system came to be and the forces that sustain it. And in particular, the fundamental racism and classism and oppression of a system that relies so heavily on policing and prisons as a form of social control. And so I sort of think about mass incarceration as generally descriptive in terms of talking about what this system looks like, who is under control in some way. And I think of the PIC as both descriptive and explanatory. And so to hopefully clarify this a little bit. Oh, I went backwards. Okay. So this first definition comes from the organization Critical Resistance, and they define the PIC as a term used to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry to use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. That's the first. So overlapping interests, all these different interests at play, using these tools, surveillance, policing, punishment, as a solution to all these different problems. The second comes from sociologists Brewer and Heitzig, and they define the PIC as a self-perpetuating machine where the vast profits and the perceived political benefits lead to policies that are additionally designed to ensure an endless supply of clients for the criminal justice system. And I think a key phrase here is self-perpetuating. So thinking about why do we actually have this system? How does it sustain itself? And when we're talking about the PIC, we're talking about a set of interests who are sort of fundamentally dependent on the punishment system for their survival. And so we're going to dig into that in a second. But this broad range of interests includes industry, the media, politicians. We can dive down, into what types of companies specifically within sort of the business world, the police themselves. Police hold a lot of power and they wield a lot of power. And before we move on, I want to note one point, which is that there are vast profits involved in the business of punishment. But that extends far beyond private prisons and prison labor, some of the main things that you often hear about. And it really, so when we're talking about the profits associated with this system, we're talking about those things, but we're also talking about all of the contracts, all of the technology, all of the tools and equipment that go into making this system possible. When we're talking about perceived political benefits, we're talking about politicians who are capitalizing on tough on crime rhetoric for their election or for their re-election. We're talking about the media who generates clicks and profits from crime headlines. So it's all of these factors coming together. It's about mapping these relationships. And so I want to go through just a couple of visuals. I really want to spend the bulk of tonight talking about abolition and not the PIC itself, but just want to make sure that we have some common terminology here. oh my gosh, I don't know why I keep going backwards. So this first one, we're not going to like dig into all of the different pieces on there. And I would actually add some things. I would fill in a couple more if I were making this right now. But this is sort of one start to see how when we're talking about the PIC, we're not just talking about politicians and for-profit prisons, that sort of thing. We're talking about all of the different players and factors that contribute to this system and that then become reliant on this system. And that's where we come back to the self-perpetuating nature of it. And so we're also looking at who is building the prisons, who is managing the prisons, who is financing the prisons. And we're not just talking about prisons, we're talking about who's making the technology for your ankle monitor when you are on probation or pretrial release, right? We're talking about all of these different areas of the system. And then we're looking at what are the products when we have this system? What are all of the social consequences that both feed into and are products of the PIC? To give another visual, this comes from critical resistance, and this is sort of, you sort of have to turn your head to see this one. And I'm happy to share all these graphics afterward. But I think this really helps. So this really helps sort of articulate that the PIC is a set of interests. So there are all these interests that are empowered by forces such as racism and xenophobia and sexism and more. And they use the tools of prisons and police and surveillance as a response to a broad range of social problems, poverty, homelessness, joblessness, the list goes on. It targets the groups of people that we know it targets. And what it produces is more brokenness and more poverty and more homelessness, more of the things that then feed back into the original cycle, right? That we try to incarcerate our way out of these problems. And so again, the point of this is to say that when we're talking about this system, we're not just talking about there are 2.2 million people incarcerated. We're not even just talking about the 5 million people who are on parole and probation. We're also talking about the basic system that even makes those mammoth numbers of people who we are controlling every day, the system that makes that possible or desirable for, for those in power. To put a finer point on it, this is a map that I've been working on for a piece that I'm trying to put together about the prison industrial complex in Atlanta. I live in Atlanta and have been doing some organizing around this big police training facility that they're trying to build. And again, we're not gonna go through each of these, and I'm sure this looks incredibly chaotic. But the point is that when we're talking about the PIC, we're mapping relationships. We're mapping the relationships that make mass criminalization and mass human caging and surveillance of our daily lives normal or expected or a taken for granted feature of our society. And the reason I'm showing this is because I think it's important to show that this is not theoretical when we're talking about the PIC. We're actually talking about an active set of interests that are actively working in our towns, in our cities, in our states, and not in some sort of conspiratorial way where we're going to break the law to get what we want, but they are working toward their interests in our system that sort of prizes profit over all else. All right. Going to take a deep breath there. I think I spoke really fast for that first part, but that's the PIC. That's an intro to the PIC. So if you're vibing so far, can I get a thumbs up or something like that, or a thumbs down if you are not?
Awesome, thank you, Micah. And also, you said you would share the graphics. Just
yeah, happy to share the graphics.
Thank
okay, all right. So again, there are a whole workshop series on the PIC. But if we have the PIC as this sort of monstrous and all-encompassing thing, it's not just our physical prisons, but it's also our economic systems and the various industries that feed into our system. Then what is abolition, right? What does it mean to abolish something that is so large and all-encompassing? And so to just start with the broad strokes, PIC abolition, as defined again by the organization Critical Resistance. I'm going to read this and then we're sort of going to break down the pieces. So they describe it as a political vision with the goal of 1, eliminating prisons, policing, and surveillance, and 2, creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. And abolition is both a practical organizing tool and it's a long-term goal. So I want to highlight that first section first, which is this, and what I want to say is that you can see that there are these two pieces of both elimination and creation. So we are eliminating the PIC, this massive infrastructure of mass human misery. We're working to eliminate that. And at the same time, we're working to create lasting alternatives to our current system. So we're not saying we're trying to get rid of this horrible thing and then just, you know, leave people to see what's up and see where they can go from there. We're also trying to create lasting alternatives and an entirely different system altogether. And then the second two is that abolition is both a long-term goal and an organizing tool. So in terms of a long-term goal, it is a vision for a different world. It's an end game. It's a horizon for the type of system that we want to have, the type of world that we want to live in. But then it's also an organizing tool. So it actually, the way that abolitionist theorists and organizers have sort of formulated abolition, it's really also an organizing strategy for the way that we get to the abolition, to an abolitionist future. And so in that sense, it's both sort of the what and the how. And at the end, we're going to talk about what it means for abolition to be the how, or the organizing tool of how do we actually get there. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about the vision of what abolition proposes. And so I think when you hear abolition, I don't know when the first time you heard, you know, this concept of abolishing prisons, even if it's just prisons and not the whole PIC. I think that what a lot of people hear is that, okay, we're just trying to get rid of prisons, pluck them out of this, you know, out of this otherwise maybe fine landscape, that abolition is the absence of these horrible things. But what abolitionists have been really, really firm on is that abolition is not just a negative project of unraveling the PIC, but it's actually also a building project. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore says that abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And so abolition really starts from the premise that not only does the PIC not actually keep people safe, so it's not doing this thing that many people, you know, expect out of prisons and policing, which is to keep people safe. It's not doing a very good job of that. And in fact, the PIC in itself is a massive source of harm. So if we know anything about mass incarceration, we know that these systems tear communities apart and literally kill people, whether, you know, from a cop's gun or by shortening people's lives by throwing them into cages, right? So we know that the PIC itself has been a massive source of harm in people's lives. And so while the main objection to abolition is often, well, how are we going to be safe? What abolitionists often point out is that most people are not safe right now. Under this current system, most people are not living in safety. And so, you know, the tendency is to say, well, what about murder? And abolitionists respond, what about murder? What are we doing about it right now, right? We're not stopping it right now. People are still killing other people. Our government is killing people, whether it's police who are killing people or overseas killing massive numbers of people, right? And so what about murder? Yeah, what about it? How can we actually stop it? Because what we have right now is not working to stop people from killing each other. So the point of that is to say that, you know, if we really care about murder and death and ending those things, what we need is a far different approach, because we know that our current approach of policing and prisons is neither stopping murders, and it's not stopping murders, and it's actually creating a lot of premature death. Another one that you'll hear often is, what about sexual assault? And again, an abolitionist would say, what about sexual assault? Has our current approach of policing and imprisonment stopped sexual assault from happening? We actually actively have a culture of sexual violence, one that is often, you know, propelled by those at the top, right? Most of our presidents, you know, our current president and our last president have both been accused of sexual assault and sexual violence. And so, yes, what about sexual assault? Our approach right now is not stopping it. And so abolitionists want to take these forms of harm really seriously and ask, how can we actually create safety if we know that most people are not safe right now? And so we asked, what do people actually need to feel safe? What makes someone feel safe in their neighborhood or their home? And then how can we expand on that? And what are the basic things that everyone deserves that are really prerequisites for safety? Because how can someone be safe if they don't have food or shelter or the ability to get to where they work and the ability to have enough money to survive, right? These are a lot of the questions that abolitionists ask, and we want to build up systems that can answer those questions in a real way. I'm going to go through these next two slides a little bit quickly since since the time is flying. And again, I'm sorry if I'm talking too quickly. But to just give a little bit of the historical roots of abolition, I want to highlight three key points. The first is that this modern day abolition movement is really a continuation of the movement to abolish slavery. So we know that racism and slavery never truly went away in the US. The way that W.E.B. Du Bois sort of conceptualized abolition of slavery was more than just getting rid of enslavement. So he wrote that, beyond just getting rid of enslavement, abolition actually required the creation of new democratic forms where people are fully incorporated into the current system. When we know that that never happened, instead, there were constant efforts to continue to subjugate Black people and queer and trans people, and especially Black queer and trans people, right? We know that all of these different layers have continued ever since that moment. And so abolition really takes the original abolition movement as its legacy. The second is that abolition has been theorized and practiced, especially by Black feminist organizers and organizations and incarcerated radicals. So incarcerated people often get sort of left out of the, of the lineage of abolition, and that's absolutely not the case. The third is that abolition is an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-oppression, intersectional and international movement. And I know that's a lot of words, and it's a lot to be that many things, but it really is this sort of grand vision of an entirely different system. I'm going to skip past this slide, except for just to say, I just want to provide sort of a visual look at that even this modern day abolition movement is not new. The movement to abolish punishment and imprisonment existed long before what we know as mass incarceration today existed. So people were calling for the abolition of prisons long before the 70s, when the prison population really started to pick up. So sometimes people are like, where's this idea coming from? And it's been around, again, for a long time. It was, right out of slavery, there were folks noting the ways in which racism and enslavement had morphed into imprisonment. To sort of wrap up this section, a way that has been really helpful for me to come to understand abolition is that it's really this dual-pronged project of not just tearing down the PIC, but also building up institutions of true safety. And so we can talk about both of these more, but really what abolitionists are trying to do is identify what is making people unsafe. What are the destabilizing presences in our world? What are the sources of harm, right? Both interpersonal and systemic. And how can we tear those down? And at the same time, abolitionists are asking, what does actually make people safe, and what stabilizes communities, and what are the sources of life and relationships and joy in our society, and how can we build those up? How can we make sure that everyone has what they need? All right, so that's sort of PIC abolition at a glance. I want to dig into a couple key concepts. I think I've got about 15 minutes. The first is harm versus crime. So a lot of times when somebody hears abolition, they're like, well, we're never gonna get rid of crime. We're never gonna get rid of harm. Those things are often used interchangeably, crime and harm. And a really key concept for the abolitionist movement is that these two things are very, very different. So critical resistance notes that crime, the use of the word crime varies depending on time and place. And really, it is a legal category to name acts that are considered violations of the law by the state, right? Crime is actually an incredibly specific legal categorization that sometimes, includes things that are harmful, and sometimes includes things that no one would consider harmful. But it really is, at the end of the day, this sort of state designation. Whereas harm is this sort of far more larger encapsulating idea of both, something that one person does to another. So everything from yelling at your partner, hurting someone's feelings, to killing someone else. But then it's also the effect and the product of oppression or violence that is carried out by the state. And as critical resistance notes, these things are often linked. And so we're thinking about harm, when we're thinking about harm versus crime, something that Miriam Kaba notes is that it is harm, not crime, that is our metric. So what we're trying to stop or prevent or heal from is harm. We don't want harm, whether it's interpersonal or systemic. But what we're not as concerned about is crime, because we know that this state that has been racist from slavery to the present. We know that there was never some magical point where our governing institutions became non-racist. We're not all that concerned with what the state has to say about crime, because we know that they are not the arbiter of what is actually good and just for our people, and we can look at that by the way that the state has sort of weaponized the designation of crime to imprison a ton of people and break up a ton of communities. Second key concept is abolition versus reform. And there's a lot to say on this. What I want to highlight is a quote from Micah Herskind, who says that the distinction between abolitionists and reformers is that reformers tend to see the system as broken. So something that can be fixed with some tweaks or some changes, we're just going to try to fix it. This thing is broken and we're trying to make it work again. Whereas abolitionists think that the system works really well. They think that the PIC is completely efficient in containing, controlling, killing, and disappearing the people it is meant to. And so this, I think, is a really key distinction. When people ask, why abolition, why not reform? And there's sort of a basic difference in framework and approach to the system, where a lot of time sort of reform or reformism leads to trying to fix the system. And what abolitionists point out is that this system is not broken, right? This system from the start was created as a racist institution that served those in power and maintained wealth inequality and racism and classism. And we've seen police deployed to quash protests anytime they happen, right? We know that this system is not broken, and it wasn't built to be some institution of public safety. And so we're not trying to fix it because we actually think that it's doing the work that it was designed to do. And so when we're talking about reform, we often get sort of stuck in this continual process of trying to fix the punishment system. And this is both Democrats and Republicans who have been involved in this for a long time. And the abolitionists are really sort of ardent about the idea that this system is not broken. It's working perfectly well according to its goals and its design. The third, which sort of we will segue into from the previous one, is whether reformism, and I want to say ism because it's not reform, because I do think that there are some really good reforms that we can pursue, but reformism as sort of trying to fix this system, is it a problem or is it the solution? I think a lot of times we think it's the solution. But what Angela Davis says is, if the words prison reform so easily slip from our lips, it's because prison and reform have been inextricably linked since the beginning of the use of imprisonment as the main means of punishing those who violate social norms. So Angela Davis is pointing out that the first prisons in the US were themselves a reform away from corporal punishment. And it was the Quakers, who were super well-intentioned, who led that push to bring us prisons instead of chopping someone's hand off or killing someone. Of course, killing the state murder of people has persisted in the death penalty, but the prison itself was a reform. And so you can look at the past, especially 50 to 70 years of especially federal involvement in the prison system, but also at the state level. And we can see that reformers have been there the whole time, and there's sort of been this endless quest to perfect punishment or call it something different like rehabilitation. And the result is always that we actually expand or replicate or further entrench the punishment system. And so there's sort of this basic historical truth that I think the abolition movement points out, which is that historically, attempts to fix the punishment system have inevitably just replicated it. And that's, again, because it's not broken and in need of fixing. And so when we're thinking about making punishment better, I think there's a basic question that we have to ask ourselves that I think is a moral and a political question, which is that, why do we think that cages, handcuffs, surveillance cameras, cop cars, people with guns. Why do we think all of those things at the end of the day is a good way to respond to harm? So why do we insist on hanging on to punishment? Those are some key concepts that I think are hopefully helpful in sort of distilling what is the abolition movement really after, and trying to accomplish, and why abolition and not reform. But so if we have this grand vision, what I want to spend the rest of our time on is, so we have this vision, we know we're trying to tackle harm, not crime. We know that our goal is dismantling a functioning system rather than fixing one that's not broken. But how do we get there, right? So we know prison walls are not just going to crumble tomorrow. I think that abolitionists are deeply practical people and organizers. And people are, and abolitionists are organizing all the time to work toward an abolitionist reality. And so I want to give a brief overview of some of these different strategies and frameworks. And again, you could do a workshop on any of these. So this will be really sort of high level. So the first is non-reformist reform. So something else that Rachel Herskind says is that a reform is really just a change. So you can have negative reforms, you can have positive reforms. You can make a change that makes the system bigger, that entrenches it further, that improves its ability to function. And those things we would think of as non-abolitionist goals, because you're growing this system that we know is oppressive. Or she says you can take an incremental step that steals some of the PIC's power away and makes it more difficult for the system to function, decreases its legitimacy. So Berger, Kaba, and Stein write that a non-reformist reform is a measure that reduces the power of an oppressive system while illuminating the system's inability to solve the crises that it creates. So non-reformist reforms are really about asking, how do we take resources and power and funding and legitimacy away from this system, rather than pouring more resources into it in the hope of fixing it or making it better? Just put these up for a second, but this is really to say, there are some really helpful frameworks around assessing, is this thing that we're advocating for, is it a non-reformist reform? Is it going to put more power in the hands of the system, or is it going to put more power in the hands of our people and those who are fighting this system? Just for the sake of time, we're going to keep going, but really sort of the punchline of non-reformist reform when we're organizing in campaigns, whether it's at the local level, the state level, national, whatever it is that we don't want to advocate for structures that we'll later have to dismantle. So to take an example in New Jersey, something that reformers really brought to New Jersey were drug courts. So drug courts were going to be these alternative sentencing courts where people were going to go instead of going to prison. And this was sort of a progressive reform. What has happened is that this new capacity was built up within the criminal legal system. And instead of sending less people to prison, now we've just channeled a whole new group of people to drug courts, and we keep people in our prisons. And New Jersey has had some encouraging movement in terms of decreasing its prison population, while at the same time sort of having, the amount that they have reduced it, they have expanded that in all of these different forms of community control. And so again, we're trying to not advocate for structures that we'll later need to dismantle. To give it a couple examples, again, of the real practicality of abolitionist campaigns, abolitionists are working on stopping prison construction, closing jails, reducing police presence and funding in their cities, reducing the technology and equipment available, trying to demilitarize communities, get police out of schools, free people, whether individuals or whole groups of people, from prisons and jails, and change the law. So abolitionists are doing policy work all the time. And these are really sort of concrete, practical campaigns that are being worked on. I'm going to skip that. Another framework, and again, thinking about, the tearing down part is maybe how we think about non-reformist reform, but the building up part is how are we going to build new ways of relating to each other and new systems that can prevent and address violence or harm when it happens without relying on police and prisons. And so one framework is community accountability. And these are really, this is sort of broad, but really any strategy to address violence or harm that doesn't rely on these carceral systems and instead relies on communities to come together and work through what the harm was and what caused it and why it happened, and also transform the conditions that made that harm possible in the first place. And so here's when we can think about individual and small level actions like, do you know your neighbors? And do you know who you can call besides the police if there's a problem? And do we have a plan for how we respond to various issues instead of calling the police? Are we making sure that we're taking care of the needs of people in our communities? And are we making sure that we're proactively addressing the kinds of situations that might lead to harm in the first place? And so this is just one framework to begin thinking through how do we sort of transform our relationships to each other to create safety in our communities and stop relying on these oppressive systems. And thinking about restorative justice, transformative justice, community accountability, I think a lot of them boil down to this question of when harm happens, or really when crime happens under our current system, the basic question is, who did it? Who needs to be handcuffed? Who needs to be caged? Who needs to be thrown away? Whereas for abolitionists, when harm happens, some of the questions that are asked is, what does the person who was harmed need, right? What are the needs of the person who actually experienced harm? Because we know our current system doesn't actually address the needs of those who are harmed. What does the person who did harm need, right? So someone who did harm is also going to need some sort of support to stop doing that harm and to begin transforming their behavior. And that's not some idealistic notion. And these processes can be really difficult and really hard. But if we don't want to throw people away, if we decide that it is against our collective morality to throw people in cages when they do something that violates the law, then we're going to have to figure out, how we can support people who have done harm. We want to think about beginning the work of repair and stopping similar things from happening again, and transforming the conditions that allowed this harm to happen in the first place. There's a broad range of other strategies that abolitionists use: divest, invest, so taking resources out of the prison system and putting them into our communities. So I'm part of a coalition here in Atlanta that's trying to close the city jail and replace it with a center for wellness, equity, and freedom. So rather than being a jail where people who are poor are taken, we're trying to close that down and replace it with a place where people can go for resources that they need. Of course, harm reduction is an incredible strategy and framework, especially approaching people who use drugs or might have a drug dependency. Mutual aid is crucial and has come up so much during the pandemic. And then, of course, direct support to incarcerated people. So we want to make sure that the abolition movement keeps incarcerated people really central in our work. There are so many other things you can do on a local level. I think it's really important that our average citizens know who is our district attorney, what's our police department's budget, what's the status of our local jail, and is there a fight to close it? Who's already doing the work that we can join in? All of this is really just to say that there are deeply practical campaigns going on all the time to build toward this abolitionist world. I'm going to end on this slide, which is, I think that this task feels daunting, right? How are we going to do this? This is also, the PIC is so big, police power and the power of this government and this system is so big. How can we possibly take it on? And how will we ever live in a world without prisons? And something that Angela Davis says is that all these institutions that we think of as in the past, slavery, lynching, segregation, those were social institutions that were considered to be everlasting. Like, these are things that we are just going to always have. There are people trying to reform slavery, right? Make slavery a little more humane. Yet in all three of those examples, she says, we can look at movements that assume this radical stance of saying that we need to abolish these institutions, not fix them, not improve them, but abolish them. And so she says, if we're already persuaded that racism should not be allowed to define the planet's future, and if we can successfully argue that prisons are racist institutions, which I hope that we can, then this can lead us to really take seriously the prospect of declaring prisons obsolete and working to abolish them. That's all I have. 7:40 exactly. I'm sorry that I sort of flew through that, but thanks for having me, everyone.
Thank you, Micah, so much for providing so much information. In fact, I've had several people ping me to ask can we do a Q&A before we do anything else? Is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, awesome. So at this point, I'd like to open up the space for questions that anyone might have for Micah. And I just before we get started, I have to say, you can either raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. I have to say, I've been in a couple of nationwide abolition workshop types things, and many of the people that Micah quoted in his presentation have also mentioned Micah's work. So, he's doing it. So, Andrea S., you have a question. Please go ahead and ask it.
Sure. I loved everything that you put forth and all of the work that you put into it. It's really, really great. Thank you. My question is, or maybe, I don't know if it's a question, and maybe it's a question and a statement, but one of the things, a variable that may make a difference, or I can ask you if you think it would make a difference, is looking at what in the prison population, there's a significant number of people in that population who are in there unjustly. So as far as collecting data that may make a difference, or maybe if you think it may make a difference, is collecting data to find out how many people are in prison because they couldn't make bail. How many people are currently in prison from $25 worth of marijuana? How many people are in prison because they were mistaken for someone else? How many people? So there's so many different variables inside of of people who are already inside of the prison. Is that taken into consideration with the abolitionists as far as when you're collecting your data and you're responding to eliminating the prison and getting waiting your case for abolishing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple thoughts in response. The first, I think, is that, so like you said, I think you're completely right that there are a lot of cases that we can look at and say, this person so obviously didn't even, break the law that they were accused of breaking, right? We have all of these wrongful convictions, or we can look at a law and say, this is so obviously, not a harmful behavior, right? Someone has a cup of weed. I was at Princeton. I can tell you all the hard drugs people had all the time, and who thought we needed to go and break down the Princeton kids' doors, right? We know that there are some things that are, so overtly racist and just absolutely outrageous. And so I think that there are, there's space for that's definitely, data that's collected, and there's space to organize campaigns around those things. I think that maybe one departure point, or maybe one reframe that the abolitionist movement makes, is saying, while we can point to some of these cases, sometimes saying that, well, these people are unjustly imprisoned. Well, does that mean that the rest of those who are in cages are justly imprisoned? And so what does it mean for someone to be, rightfully incarcerated? And something that abolitionists often point out is that, there's a little bit of this narrative that the reason that we have mass incarceration is because of low-level drug offenses, that sort of thing, sort of all of these low-level offenses. And the fact is, when you look at the prison population, it is actually made up of majority people who have been convicted of violent offenses. And so something that abolitionists, work really hard to do is reframe the narrative around what does it mean to deserve to be in a cage, and what even is violence, right? We slap the label of violent offender on people, and what actually happened and why did it happen? We have prison as this sort of one size fits all of, if you're convicted of something called violent, then we're going to throw you away forever. And the fact is, something that Danielle Sered says is that no one enters violence for the first time by committing it. And so often you have people who have experienced extreme violence that that maybe then have committed a violent act. And so what are we going to do then? Are we then okay with abandoning people, to languish in cells, or do we still want to find other solutions? So I think that, the answer I would give to your question is yes. I think that we pursue those strategies of trying to, decriminalize things where we can and capitalize on movements where we can, while also, doing a broader reframe around the idea that prisons aren't a good solution for anyone, no matter what they have or haven't done.
Thank you. I have a question from Surya that I'm not even sure I understand. Is felony enfranchisement considered a reform rather than an abolitionist policy change?
I would definitely say, that re-enfranchising people is a really good thing, a really important thing, and a needed thing. When I look at the criteria of what makes a reformist reform, I think that is something that actually shifts power to those who have been disenfranchised and oppressed, rather than putting more power back into the hands of this system. And so, of course, the end goal is we're trying to free people, but it's really good to, give people the right to vote who are both in prison and out of prison, because that is something that, begins to shift power in some way. So I would definitely support, re-enfranchisement efforts as an important abolitionist policy change. Of course, we can go about it in problematic ways. We can do things like, oh, well, this person was only convicted of this low-level offense, so they deserve to vote, but other people don't deserve to vote, right? And so we don't want to do that and draw these lines of deserving, undeserving. But I would say that's a really important step for sure.
Thank you. Connie Langobin says, well, there's a lot of thank you, great information, Micah's in there. Thank you so much, Micah. Do you know of any examples of prisons being, I should have brought my glasses, sorry, replaced by restorative justice systems? Is there any place in the US that would be a likely site of prison abolition?
Sorry, I was just responding to these. Okay. I wouldn't say like, that's not the way that I've seen sort of abolitionist movements work necessarily, where, a state is going to say, well, we're getting rid of this and we're replacing it with this. There are movements like I mentioned in Atlanta where, we're trying to replace this jail with a Center for Wellness and Equity. And I think like restorative justice would absolutely be a practice that would be, there would be space for restorative justice in that sort of space. And something Angela Davis says is that what we want to do is create these alternatives that crowd out the prison. So through this building work, we're trying to create all these new ways of living and responding to and preventing harm that make the prison, feel less necessary and feel more obsolete. In terms of large-scale replacement, I'm not aware of that, but I think that people are practicing restorative justice in their communities, and sometimes more formalized. So there's more formalized programs. I think the New York City court system has some restorative justice, pathways. I've heard people be skeptical of those because often there's a if you don't make it through the process, then you're back in prison. And having sort of this process that is based on coercion is, really defies the principles of restorative justice. I'll post a link to a resource guide that I put together that has a section on restorative justice, though, and hopefully that might be helpful.
Thank you, Micah. Norma Bauer has a question.
Yeah, in my own work and observing conditions here in Lansing, Michigan, I see that the prison industrial complex is so vast that there's a lot of people who think of themselves as really good people. They're doing the drug court thing and they're doing the parole thing, or even some, people try to be good at public defending or something. And that's where their money comes from. That's what supports their family. And so you get some pushback from people with Eurocentric brains that, well, prisons keep us safe from these bad people. Do you have any suggestions on ways to help them see that they're stuck in a really rotten system? I think the first question in my criminology class, what is the number one cause of crime? Laws.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's so hard. And so, so much that, I mean, there are a bunch of, public officers unions that are incredibly powerful and that make it very hard to break the power of the system. And that's because, when someone's livelihood depends on a system, of course, it's going to be really hard to convince them that livelihood is fundamentally immoral. I think that I think that there's one route to go of showing that prisons, to take prisons as an example, prisons are not good for anyone in them, right? The suicide rate and the premature death rates for guards in prisons are high, right? They're higher than average. And so I think there's one approach to take, which is that, this is not good for anyone who's touching this system. Another one is to say, how can we actually find, how can we ensure that people have good jobs outside of this, and how can we create pathways to good jobs outside of the system? And so part of this Atlanta effort is creating a plan that will replace the current jail guards into a different profession under the city. So still be city employees, but be working in a different profession than what they're working in right now. And so that's not a very specific answer. I think it's really hard. I think that there's similar questions around ideas of a Green New Deal and transitioning our economy away from fossil fuels and all these things. And people's jobs depend on this. And so I think there's a lot of connections to be made. And I think that I would look to a lot of environmental organizing, honestly, for insight into how to maybe do that effectively.
Thank you.
Thank you, Micah. Caroline, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to do it? All right, I'll do it. Or Caroline, are you there? I'll do it. Okay, awesome presentation. Oop, I'm going to mute you, Caroline. Oh, can you talk now?
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. It was really informative, right? So I keep hearing, these politicians, these pro-prison industrial complex politicians who keep saying, well, the people in the hood, they want the police. They need the police more than anybody else, right? So how do we get the people who are over-policed, right, and who they know nothing else but this system, how do we get them to buy into that they can be safe and have, decent neighborhoods without a heavy police presence? Because they have a heavy police presence and they don't have decent neighborhoods, but they don't think that the absence of the police will contribute to improved neighborhoods. So I feel like it's a really tight rope to walk.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that is so important and really, really difficult. A couple things come to mind. The first one is an example that comes from Danielle Surratt, and I heard it used by Miriam Kaba, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit because I don't fully remember it, but something that she talks about is that the police in prisons are sort of like a hamburger stand that sells terrible, disgusting burgers out in the middle of a desert. And hopefully I'm getting this right. But so it's the one place where you can go to like kind of get the thing that you think that you need. And so what happens is that you have some people who are like, well, I'm not going to get anything else, so I'm going to go to this hamburger stand. Some people are driving by on the highway and they're like, well, like, I know I'm not going to get anything good from that, so I'm going to keep going and be hungry and not be well. And so, we can keep going with all the different examples. But I start with that to say that, to echo your point that what we have right now is, it's not anything good, but to a lot of people, it feels like something. And something that Derek Purnell says, I think she's quoting Michelle Alexander, is that, when you have nothing, even a bad thing feels like something. And so I say that to say that I think one way of going about it is to begin creating these alternative institutions that we know people need and could benefit from to again begin to crowd out the prison. So to give you an example, here in Atlanta, there's this effort that was that came together a couple years ago that has sort of been institutionalized, called the Policing Alternatives and Diversion Program. And so it started as basically, if police are about to arrest someone, it's a pre-arrest diversion program. So the police could call this organization PAD, Policing Alternatives and Diversion, and they would show up and give service and provide, services. So if someone was sleeping on the streets and they were going to be arrested and cited for urban camping, PAD can show up and help someone get into a home or a shelter or something like that. And that's how they started, was that the police had to sort of refer someone to PAD. And as they've been expanding, now they've started a 311 line where anyone can call it and a PAD team can show up and help provide whatever service or meet whatever need is necessary. And that's not to say that PAD is a perfect program or that that's some sort of silver bullet solution, but rather to say that when we start addressing some of the reasons that people think that they need police, that's one of the most effective ways of sort of overcoming this this idea that we need police. Police is all we have. Like that's if it's not police, it's nothing. And so I think one of the most effective ways is to actually just begin building that alternative and say, like, you're right. Police is all all that are showing up, and they often don't even show up when you think that you need them. And so what can we do to actually start meeting people's needs? I think that, and then the other point that I'll end this now lengthy answer with is that, me personally, as a white person who has not lived in poverty, I'm not going to go tell someone, well, you don't need the police, right? Like that's not my role. That wouldn't be appropriate for me. I think that though conversations are, can really get people far when you talk about not just do you want the police or do you not want the police, but what is it that you want from the police? Why are you calling the police? What is it that you hope that they would give you? And what resources or services might be provided that would eliminate your perceived need for the police? So those are the two answers that come to mind. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Micah. Connie asks, can you give some examples of the community accountability and what that looks like?
Sure. So I think one of the basic sort of premises of community accountability is saying that as a community, we are taking responsibility for preventing and responding to harm when it happens. And so sometimes community accountability looks like someone has hurt someone, whether that's in a minor way or whether in an instance of sexual violence or something really serious. And so in a community accountability process, restorative justice practices often come in that. So we can say we're going to get together a bunch of community members, the person who has caused harm, the person who has experienced harm, and we're going to work through this, and we're going to make sure that the person who was harmed has their needs met, and we're going to make sure that the person who harmed someone transforms their behavior and doesn't cause that harm again. And so, there are specific examples that I can think of where, I know people who have gone through these types of processes. Part of this work that sort of I'm most interested in or most involved with, or where I have some experience, is thinking about community accountability on the front end of communities taking responsibility for preventing harm before it happens. And so I'm part of this organization, Georgia Freedom Letters. It's a collective of about 10 of us working around Georgia prisons and running a pen pal program. And something that we did when we first started is we got together and we said, if harm happens in this space, if one of, we know that people hurt each other, again, whether, in small ways or big ways, what are we going to do? How are we going to be prepared? What is our action plan for if someone, causes harm to someone? Let's have a plan to actually address it and make sure that we are all taking responsibility together for trying to stop it from happening. And then if it does happen, to respond to it. And so I think that sometimes community accountability looks like people coming together and saying, what are we going to do to prevent harm, and how are we going to be ready for when it happens? And so I know that that's not super specific. There are some really good resources around these types of processes. Mariam Kaba and Shira Hassan's, does anyone have the name? Kim, I feel like you might have it.
I'll look it up. We have it
Okay,
at the library. We have it at the
Oh,
library.
it's at the library. So they have this amazing workbook. They're, longtime restorative justice practitioners, and they've done a lot of community accountability work. And they have a lot of like step-by-step work. Another website that I would recommend, I believe it's called 1 Million Experiments. And they, yeah, I'm gonna just drop the link real quick. They've got a bunch of examples of, abolitionist projects all over of people just trying things. So their sort of premise is that in order to, get toward abolition, it's not going to be one program that comes down from the top. We need a million different experiments of people working to meet each other's needs, of people working to organize their workplace and, create more worker power. We need people doing all of these different things. And so I think that, and then I'm going to drop one more site, but I hope that those will be helpful in giving some specifics.
The book is Fumbling Towards Repair, which is
Fumbling Towards Repair, yes.
Beautiful title. Okay, I have another question. I feel like we only have once in the chat, but you touched on this a little bit. It's something that's really a hard hurdle for people to get over as they're considering this, which is, can you give some more specifics of how we would address the most violent crimes in lieu of prisons? And I know you've written about this. So. Yeah.
This is a great question because as organizers, we have to respond to sort of the most pressing questions. It's also a really hard one because there's so many places to jump in. I think I'll give a couple answers. So the first one is that there are people who are working to intervene in violence before it happens. So, recognize where is, the violence, or at least the violence that people end up in prison for, where is that happening most frequently? And how can we show up and try to prevent it from happening in the first place? So violence interrupters, there's an organization called Cure Violence. These are people who are sort of doing on the ground work in communities who are saying, we see this violence happening and we want to stop it. There's an amazing youth organization in Chicago that's doing a lot of work around gun violence, Good Kids, Mad City. And they're sort of actively working in their communities to prevent gun violence from happening. So that's sort of prevention. When we think about response, it's hard, right? Because violence is terrible and we don't want violence to happen to anyone, and it's really messy. And so, when we think about responding to really heinous violence, I think that, a very unsatisfying answer is that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, because violence is really context dependent. And why did someone hurt someone in the way that they did? Can we understand why it happened and how it happened and how we might prevent it from happening in the future? We know that most violence, most murder happens between people who already know each other. It's not some random serial killer vibe happening. And so, what is it that we how are we going to intervene before it happens and try to mend these relationships and mend the systems like patriarchy that give way to so many forms of violence in the first place. So that's the second answer, is response, is that it's difficult and context dependent. And there are these amazing frameworks of restorative justice and transformative justice, but I know that that's not quite satisfying. The third answer that I would sort of move toward, and this is sort of a more systemic one that's maybe also a little unsatisfying, is that we really need to reframe violence. Because, when we think about violence, you often think about violent crime, right? And what that most often means is some sort of interpersonal violence, someone hitting someone, stabbing someone, killing someone, a robbery, something that we think of as sort of interpersonal violence. And those things happen and are serious. And yet, that actually accounts for a small slice of violence in our society. We can disagree on this, but in my understanding, our country is characterized by violence. It was built on the violence of indigenous genocide and slavery, and that has continued in policy through to our current system in which we have massive wealth and racial inequality, and people are living, homeless every day while we have vacant homes, and people don't have food, and children are drinking poisoned water, and so we have all, cops are killing people or caging people, handcuffing people. We have all of these different forms of violence that somehow get left out of the discussion of what violence is. And so when we're thinking about violence, yes, we absolutely want to address that interpersonal violence. We also want to address, the violence, and this is where our concept of harm comes back in. We want to address harm that is both interpersonal and systemic. I had one more point, but I think I'm only going to make it to 3 because I forgot the last one.
Well, if you think of it, you can come back to it. People are putting lots of sort of resources or things that are of interest to them in the chat, but I know that Andrea S. wanted to say something.
Oh, thank you. I love this. I didn't know that this was the topic this evening, but I have over the decades participated in probably every aspect of the quote system, from working with youth at risk to going into prisons and being with prisoners and meeting with their families and creating videos, and just a lot over the decades. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is there's so many situations that we can respond to, and they're never ending. And then, so the complexity to this whole thing it's just astounding. So I think the more, for myself, the more I connect in with an overall framework of humanity, then I can tie threads to that and look to work with an institution that I'm passionate about, because it's just never ending. And I don't think that there's ever a quote solution that's gonna take care of everything. I'm from Philadelphia, and I grew up in neighborhoods where most of the kids that I went to high school with, they're not alive, or if they are alive, some of them are living on the streets, or it's massive. However, I consider myself, I say I have my PhD, my Philly Hood degree in all of this. And I'm appreciative of everyone who's on this Zoom call, because it brings awareness, and that's the beginning of everything. It just really brings awareness to all of the information and knowledge that we had no access to prior to being on this call, and that is the beginning. So wherever you go from here will be a contribution to the future, no matter where you are and where you'll go. So I'm just appreciative of all of this. I have my own academic education, but most of my education came from my life experiences. So just thank you so much, Micah and everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that point, Andrea. And that actually reminded me of something of what I wanted to say before, because I think that you're so on point in terms of there are so many different solutions. And my last unsatisfying thought maybe about handling violence is that abolitionists don't claim to have all the answers of exactly what this system is going to look like. And I actually think it's important to sit with these really hard questions of what are we going to do about violence. Oh gosh, I just forgot it again. Abolitionists don't have all the answers, but what I think marks abolitionists is a commitment to finding those answers together. And so sometimes that question, and I'm not saying the person who asked this intended it this way, but sometimes that question feels like, if we can't come up with the lights in my office just went out. If we can't come up with a question, an answer to that question of what do we do about violence, then I guess we can't do abolition. And the fact is that, we have so much violence around us already, and so much of it, even things that could be, legal crimes that would send people to prison, we really only care about them in some circumstances. So again, I went to Princeton, this place of like enormous concentrated wealth and power and privilege. And, when the white frat boys, committed, a terrible sexual harm, they got a slap on the wrist, right? So the fact is that we already have all of these different forms of violence, and not knowing the answer to what do we do about violence doesn't, that actually doesn't shake my faith in abolition, because I know that we're gonna need to find the answers together, even though we don't have them all right now. Let me try to put some light on me.
That was kind of a great way to end, but I've got a lot of people saying thank you. People who are interested, Christina J said she's particularly interested in undoing the violence that we've internalized. You already saw Caroline's comment. I'm trying to go make sure that I didn't miss anybody. But thank you so much. Is there anything you want to finish on? Words of like what your vision of abolition is, or your like one of your favorite visions is?
I think that I really think that the vision of abolition is, the thing that's most exciting about me is just building our movement. So saying like, if we can decide collectively that this system that we have is just morally reprehensible in the same way that the system of slavery was morally reprehensible, fundamentally unsalvageable, then, how can we just get more people involved? Like if everyone on this call figures out what's an organization who's organizing near them and how can I plug in? And I'm sure a bunch of people are already doing that. The fact that we're here is amazing. And so, I maybe just end on a note of hope, which is that, the more of us involved, the better. And yeah, I'm just grateful for you all having me tonight to be able to speak to you.
Thank you so much. And if anybody is able to unmute before I press end, please feel free to, snap, wave hands, say thank you, clap, whatever you like to Micah. I see like lots of little.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Excellent.
much.
Thanks, Micah.
Thanks, Micah.
Have a
So
great night,
informative.
Micah.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Appreciate you.
Thank you all.
Mhm.